So good afternoon. I'm T.L. Hill, Professor of Strategy here at the Fox School of Business, Managing Director of our Fox Management Consulting Group. And I'm really thrilled to be joined today by Bucky Fairfax, who's a Senior Vice President of RTI International, focused on HR. And RTI is a wide-ranging nonprofit research organization that does work literally around the world on health and international development, workforce development. Bucky will tell us a little bit more about that because some of his experience has brought him has put him in the position of helping his team cope with earthquakes, tsunamis, now COVID. So he has a fair amount of insight about what it takes to bring an organization of people through a crisis and out the other side, hopefully stronger than when they went in. At least that's our hope. So Bucky, if we could start with just a little bit about RTI, a little about your own background and perhaps your role at RTI.
Sure, yeah. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining today, and TL, thanks for the invitation. Appreciate it. Happy to be here. So as TL said, my name is Bucky Fairfax. I currently lead strategic talent management at RTI International. I've been in this role for about 4 years. Prior to that, I led HR for the international development business for RTI for about 9 years. So I've been with the company for approximately 13 years. Prior to that, I worked in various international NGOs where I've held HR leadership positions or specialization in international HR operations. So as TL mentioned, it's given me the opportunity to be in a position to be able to support a variety of different crises over the course of the last 20, 25 years. And it's been quite an interesting journey, as you can imagine. With RTI, just a few things about that company real quickly, if you're interested. So we just passed our 50th anniversary. We're headquartered in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, which is the Raleigh-Durham area of North Carolina. We have over 12 offices throughout the U.S., about 13 official international offices. We have approximately 5,700 staff that are supporting projects and activities in over 50 countries around the world. As TL mentioned, we're a fairly diverse portfolio as a research institute. It's a social science research focus, international nonprofit. It's primarily government funded, but not exclusively. We also have private funding and have commercial funding. Last year, we reported about $960 million in revenue, supporting over, I think, around 1,200 projects, 1,200 clients and about 4,700 projects around the world. So our focus areas in the social science space include workforce development, education, health, food and agriculture, economic development. We also have special capabilities and surveys and data collection and advisory across civic governance and various other areas in which the Institute supports. So it's a very diverse organization. And again, in the last 13 years there, I've been involved in a variety of international activities, which I can speak to as we get into this.
Cool. Well, let's get into it, because one of the things we talked about before when we were preparing for this is you talked about, the challenges of supporting people overseas. I think it was the Nepalese earthquake, the Haitian earthquake, the tsunami in Indonesia. Now we've got a pandemic that's probably affecting all of everyone around the world, civil unrest here and elsewhere. So what do you do when a disaster strikes? What's the first thing that you do as a HR lead?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I do in terms of my area of focus, and also with regard to the organizations that I've been a part of, it starts with safety and the well-being of staff. It's important to be able to approach this with a people first kind of orientation. So you see organizations that are providing a variety of different approaches to, again, depending on the crisis, but if it's, for instance, the earthquake, or it's starting off with how do we account for our staff. What's been is over the course of the last 15 to 20 years, technology has definitely advanced our ability to be able to do that. So accounting for staff and being able to reach staff in situations where you may have either unrest or a natural disaster that has broken lines of communication can be challenging. So getting mobilized and figuring out how to account for staff. once you kind of get past that phase, I think you get to a phase where you're really focusing on the well-being of staff, and how can you support them through this response, through this transition, and I think that requires, again, you kind of a people-first orientation. It requires everything, a lot of what we're seeing today in terms of the response to the pandemic, but it requires, providing flexible arrangements for staff, either to take time off and also to continue to work as appropriate. Providing support services to staff, how to help them cope and how to help them, maintain resilience and be able to continue to engage. So through programs like employee assistance programs, flexible, arrangements, coaching and support, I think is also an important piece of this. Again, depending on the nature of the crisis, I think emergency services are also really important. So in instances where we were responding to, again, earthquakes or tsunamis or, civil unrest, and we needed to evacuate people out of the country, medical emergencies, how to, prepare and be ready for these types of things and have these tools and processes and programs and services kind of on hand to be able to address, these types of situations and support your staff and your operations. And once we get people out, again, back to those flexible arrangements and continuity practices of how do you continue working while you're continuing to attend to these crises and supporting staff. So we also see, some interesting things happening, today. I think many of us are experiencing this, but there's been this evolution of, how do you work remotely? Do you have the right technology to be able to work remotely? Do you have the right, leave practices, to be able to help people take time off? Are you seeing, different types of responses, creative and innovative with regard to workplace practices, and being able to, again, continue to support people through, a near-term and a mid-term type of planning for the response to either this pandemic or previous crises. And what's been really interesting is also seeing how organizations are leveraging some of the things that they may not think about leveraging that can help them through a crisis. So, for instance, and this I'll draw directly from my RTI experience with the current pandemic, and even more recently with the current events, is as we're looking at how we respond and support our staff, we're drawing on programs like our diversity and inclusion programs, our employee resource groups programs, our corporate social responsibility programs, and the communities that we support, and being able to use these networks and these programs and these practices to be able to help staff more broadly. So, for instance, we have an employee resource group that is based on telework, and being able to tap our telework community at the very beginning of this pandemic to be able to help us kind of frame some of the best practices and the lessons learned, where we moved from 800 people or so working remotely to almost 6,000 people working remotely was super beneficial and helped us.
So you were able to learn from, since you had already practiced in one corner, you could use that experience from one corner to go elsewhere.
Right. So some of the more intentional operational pieces, but then also some of the things that you may not think about that are less, kind of traditional that provide value. Yeah.
Yeah. So how have you drawn on the diversity inclusion sort of experience that you've had to cope? This was originally about COVID, but we can't not address the whole sort of recent, unrest about systemic racism. And so how has that happened? Because right on top of COVID, right? It's Indeed. One thing to the next.
Yeah. So on the COVID side, we were able to draw on things around, again, the teleworking side of things, also keeping in mind, as we're planning for supporting a remote workforce, tapping into, our accessibility, which is our disability ERG, to understand practices, to make sure that we have equitable and accessible types of support programs to our workforce, globally. But then when we got into the more recent events, and these things are still unfolding. This week's been a pretty active week in that regard as it relates to our work and our planning, being able to tap into our Black employee resource groups as well as our Latino employee resource groups and others to be able to help us frame and think about our messaging, to make sure that it's appropriate messaging, to make sure that it's responsive messaging, to make sure that it's sensitive and helping address some of the concerns that are happening with our staff as it relates to things that are unfolding, as well as thinking through and thinking ahead about how we look at responding and supporting staff. So it creates an interesting opportunity as well, as we're working with these groups to think through better, a better employee experience at RTI. We're also thinking through, well, how can we, again, I don't want to take advantage or leverage from this situation, but it creates a catalyst for change, right? And it gives us the opportunity to begin thinking about things that perhaps we've been working on and just nudging a little down the line, to being able to increase the attention to it, to kind of move the needle on some things that we've been planning with these various networks.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's one of the themes that's come out in this set of conversations has been that whatever initiatives or trends that were there are getting accelerated, right? And so if you've been kind of working slowly and steadily in diversity inclusion, now maybe it gets accelerated. Or if you've been kind of experimenting with telehealth, maybe now it gets accelerated, right? Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that seems different about the pandemic, and even to some degree about the current sort of unrest, is that it's not a single event, right? It's sort of an unfolding event, and there's not a clear end in sight. That seems like that would add a lot of stress and uncertainty. How has that changed things? How are you coping with that? Sort of concrete things you're doing to manage that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. As I was thinking about, this topic and some of the things that, I would share, reflecting on my own experiences, I think related to this question, TL, is a thought that I have about what I would kind of characterize as three aspects of organizational resilience. And I'll definitely get specifically to what you're asking, but I think, because all this is related, I think there are three important things that I would pull up. One is what I would call readiness. The second is responsiveness, and the third is adaptation. And I think readiness for these types of things. I mean, there was no playbook for the pandemic, right? All organizations were affected by this and not necessarily ready. But there are things that what I'm seeing more resilient organizations being ready, because they have risk management practices, they have business continuity practices, they have perhaps a change management playbook. They plan for uncertainty, right? And it helps them at the time and at the point of crisis to be able to respond without trying to figure out, what's the call tree on this? Well, we already have the call tree, or what's how do we turn things off? We already have our protocol for that. So I think a readiness preparation is important, as well as readiness through what I would call, and this has really helped us from the standpoint of not only the pandemic but also the more recent event, readiness through established leadership norms, right? Organizational values, these things that kind of guide your decision making. The responsiveness piece, I think, again, well organized and thoughtful, planned out, effective communication, and some of the things that we were talking about earlier. And then to your last point is around this adaptation piece. And I think that's some of the things that we're seeing some organizations do differently over others. I think some are less financially equipped to be able to continue through this pandemic from a long-term perspective, because perhaps their financial situation just was not as nimble or as agile or as secure, where you see others that are and give them an opportunity to be able to support staff longer, support operations longer, and to be able to come out perhaps a little bit stronger because they're reinvesting in things that are making a difference in this current time. So I'll again speak here to RTI. Some of the things that we're doing is we're focusing on where we can apply our capabilities to be able to support these types of these types of issues. We have expertise in global health. We have expertise in social injustice research and programming, and being in a position to be able to invest in the research, to invest in the programming, to invest in talent in those spaces to best position us to continue as an organization, but also, again, to adapt to what is happening. You see that adaptation as a key feature, I think, of resilience. And for some organizations, it's a benefit, and for others, and what I mean by benefit, they're benefited to be in a position to be able to do it, and for others, they've just done it. We've all heard through the pandemic about, microbreweries, kind of changing their formulas to do the hand sanitizer, and all the folks that have popped up to help with the PPEs, and as a way of survival, but also as a way of contributing to help society and to live through the pandemic. So I think the adaptation is a really big piece here.
Cool. So we're going to shift in a minute to the Q&A, but I did have one last question, which is, when do we go back and what's going to change? Mm-hmm. Just a short version of that, because I think we'll cover a lot of that in the Q&A. But so when does RTI go back, and what's going to change? Sure.
A lot has changed. Lots going to change. Our go back, we've pushed this out to after Labor Day. It's just a marker. It's not a firm date. It's a target date that we're planning towards. And I think a lot is going to change as it relates to space planning. As it relates to the office environment. As it relates to how we interact and collaborate. We just got into a new building, our headquarters building. It's a building that's built on collaboration, built around a collaboration.
Right.
So
right.
If we have less staff, then how do we think about the importance of collaboration and cross collaboration throughout the Institute that's not done in brick and mortar, that's done in the virtual platform, because we're not all in the same space. So I think that's going to change a lot. I think how we, and from a talent management perspective, how we bring talent on, how we acquire talent, how we assess, all these virtual. So I think the main thing is like how technology, and I'm sure that's a theme that you guys are seeing, is going to accelerate. That digital transformation is going to accelerate and really help these organizations kind of be able to manage the change going forward. I think what also will change, and maybe last point before Q&A, what will also change is prioritization. And, I think, as you work through the pandemic, it's reprioritized a lot of what people need to focus their energy on, right?
Right.
So for us, my area, which is talent management, we're thinking through, how does the near, midterm, and long term change how we develop leaders, how we develop staff? What are the new competencies that leaders need to have to lead in what they keep calling this new normal? But if this thing has a longer tail than we thought, it's a different skill set to be able to lead effectively in a virtual world, or a world where you're not all next to each other. So a lot will change, and we're just trying to get our arms around it.